Every emotional reaction becomes another clue. Every impulsive response becomes another weakness they may use later. Manipulation always begins with information, and careless reactions provide that information for free. This is exactly why emotional reactions are so dangerous. Imagine someone makes a small insult and you immediately become defensive. To most people, it looks like an argument. To a manipulator, it looks like valuable data. They now know that your pride is sensitive. Another person compliments you excessively, and you instantly lower your guard. Again, they have learned something important. They now know that recognition affects your judgment. Someone makes you feel guilty, and you quickly abandon your own boundaries. Once again, they discover exactly which emotional button controls your behavior. Every uncontrolled reaction teaches them how to influence you more effectively. Next time, Machiavelli understood that power belongs to the observer, not the reactor. The person who reacts emotionally is focused on the present moment. The person who observes strategically is focused on the entire pattern. That difference changes everything. Instead of asking, "How should I respond?" the observer first asks, "Why is this person behaving this way?" That single question exposes manipulation more often than any clever argument ever could. Manipulators depend on speed. They want quick emotions, quick trust, quick decisions, and quick commitments. Observation slows the entire process down, and slowing the process down removes much of their advantage. Notice how manipulators often create emotional urgency. They say things like, "You have to decide right now," or "If you really cared, you wouldn't hesitate." They know that urgency weakens logic. The faster you move, the less time you have to recognize what is actually happening. Calm people become difficult to manipulate because they refuse to let someone else control the pace of their thinking. They pause before responding. They ask questions instead of making assumptions. They become curious rather than emotional. That pause may last only a few seconds, but psychologically it creates enormous protection because it separates emotion from decision. Observation also teaches you to stop judging people by appearances alone. Manipulators are rarely obvious. Many appear generous in the beginning. Some seem incredibly confident. Others present themselves as victims who constantly need your help. Some overwhelm you with kindness and attention, while others use silence to create anxiety. The method changes, but the objective remains the same: to influence your behavior without you noticing it. If you react only to appearances, you become vulnerable. But if you patiently observe consistent behavior over time, masks begin falling away. You start noticing contradictions. Their words stop matching their actions. Their kindness becomes conditional. Their respect disappears whenever they lose control. None of these patterns are visible to impatient people. They become obvious only to those who are willing to watch before trusting. Another powerful habit is learning to become comfortable with silence. Manipulators often expect immediate answers because immediate answers are emotional answers. They ask uncomfortable questions hoping you will reveal more than you intended. They provoke arguments hoping anger will make you expose your weaknesses. But silence interrupts this process. A calm pause forces you to think instead of react. It also makes the manipulator uncomfortable because they lose the predictable response they expected. Suddenly, they no longer know exactly how to influence you. That uncertainty shifts the balance of power back into your hands. Over time, something remarkable begins happening. You stop feeling emotionally pulled into every situation. You recognize manipulation before it becomes control because you have trained yourself to notice patterns instead of isolated moments. You no longer trust charming words without observing consistent behavior. You stop confusing urgency with importance. You stop allowing compliments, criticism, guilt, or fear to dictate your decisions. Instead, you begin responding from awareness rather than emotion. That transformation makes manipulation incredibly difficult because manipulators depend on automatic reactions, not thoughtful observation. The greatest protection against manipulation is not becoming suspicious of everyone. It is becoming disciplined enough to observe people before allowing your emotions to make decisions. Once you develop that habit, you no longer become an easy target because your mind belongs to you instead of to the person trying to influence it. Because the moment you learn to observe before you react, you take away the very advantage every manipulator depends on to control you. Most people imagine manipulation as something dramatic, a direct lie, an obvious threat, or a person openly trying to control them. But the most effective manipulators rarely operate that way. Their greatest strength is that they make manipulation feel normal. They hide control inside ordinary conversations, acts of kindness, emotional moments, and seemingly harmless requests. That is why one of the most important skills you can ever develop is recognizing the hidden weapons manipulators use every single day. The moment you can identify these tactics while they are happening, they lose much of their power. Manipulation depends on unconscious participation. Once your awareness increases, the manipulator is forced to work much harder because you are no longer responding automatically. One of the oldest and most effective manipulation tactics is guilt. Instead of directly asking you to do something, the manipulator makes you feel like a bad person if you refuse. They say things such as, "After everything I've done for you," or "I guess I just care more than you do." Notice what is happening. They are not discussing the actual issue anymore. They are attacking your conscience. Their goal is to make you feel responsible for their emotions so that you abandon your own judgment. Machiavelli understood that anyone who can make you feel guilty on command can slowly begin controlling your decisions. The strongest defense is remembering that genuine kindness never demands obedience through guilt. Healthy relationships respect your freedom to choose. Another powerful weapon is gaslighting. This is one of the most dangerous forms of psychological manipulation because it attacks your confidence in your own perception. The manipulator may deny things they clearly said, rewrite past events, or insist that you are too sensitive, imagining things, or overreacting. Over time, the victim begins questioning their own memory instead of questioning the manipulator's behavior. This confusion creates dependence because once you stop trusting your own judgment, you begin relying on someone else's version of reality. That is exactly what the manipulator wants. The moment you notice someone repeatedly making you doubt obvious facts, you should stop defending your memory and start examining their pattern. Then there is love bombing, a tactic that often appears at the beginning of relationships, friendships, or business partnerships. Everything feels perfect. The attention is overwhelming. The compliments never stop. They make you feel as though you have finally met someone who understands you completely. At first, it feels flattering, but excessive affection delivered too quickly often has a hidden purpose. It encourages emotional attachment before trust has been earned. Once dependence forms, the affection slowly disappears and is replaced by control. Suddenly, you begin working harder just to receive the same attention that was once given freely. Healthy relationships grow steadily. Manipulative ones often begin with emotional intensity that feels too good to question. Playing the victim is another tactic many people fail to recognize. Some manipulators rarely accept responsibility for anything. Every failure is someone else's fault. Every conflict proves that the world has treated them unfairly. They present themselves as the injured party because they understand that compassionate people naturally lower their defenses around those who appear to be suffering. Eventually, you find yourself constantly rescuing, apologizing, or sacrificing your own needs while they avoid accountability. Compassion is a beautiful quality, but it becomes dangerous when it blinds you to repeated patterns of irresponsibility. Manipulators also understand the power of urgency. They create pressure because pressure weakens critical thinking. They tell you that an opportunity will disappear if you do not decide immediately. They insist that you must answer right now because waiting somehow proves you do not care. But truly important decisions rarely become better because they are rushed. Urgency often serves the manipulator far more than it serves you. Calm people recognize this immediately. Instead of reacting to pressure, they slow the conversation down. They ask questions. They request time to think. That single habit destroys countless manipulation attempts because emotional pressure loses its influence once logical thinking returns. Selective praise is another subtle weapon. A manipulator may constantly compliment you, but only when you behave exactly as they want. The praise is never unconditional. It becomes a reward for obedience. The moment you disagree, set a boundary, or become independent, the compliments disappear. Instead, criticism replaces them. Over time, people become conditioned to seek approval by behaving in ways that satisfy the manipulator. This creates emotional dependence disguised as encouragement. The safest response is learning to value honest feedback more than flattering words. Confidence rooted in your own principles cannot be controlled through compliments. Perhaps the most misunderstood tactic is the silent treatment. Many people assume silence simply means someone needs space. Sometimes that is true, but manipulators use silence differently. They withdraw communication not to find peace, but to create anxiety. They want you wondering what you did wrong. They hope uncertainty will make you chase them, apologize unnecessarily, or abandon your own boundaries simply to restore harmony. The silence itself becomes punishment. Emotionally disciplined people recognize this difference. They respect healthy space, but they refuse to reward silence that is clearly designed to create fear or guilt. As you begin recognizing these patterns, something remarkable happens. You stop responding only to words and start paying attention to intentions. Instead of asking, "What are they saying?" You begin asking, what reaction are they trying to create inside me? That single question changes everything, because manipulation is never really about conversation. It is about influence. Once you identify the emotional outcome someone is trying to produce, their strategy becomes much easier to resist, because the moment you recognize the hidden weapons of manipulation, you stop becoming an easy target and start becoming someone who cannot be controlled without your permission. There is one truth that every manipulator understands better than most ordinary people, and once you recognize it, you will begin seeing manipulation everywhere. The person who controls your emotions eventually controls your decisions. They do not need to force you physically, because emotional influence is far more effective than physical force. If someone can make you angry whenever they choose, they can predict your reactions. If they can make you feel guilty on command, they can push you into sacrifices you never intended to make. If they can trigger your fear, your insecurity, or your desperate need for approval, they no longer have to fight for control. You begin handing it to them yourself. This is why emotional discipline is not simply a personality trait. It is one of the strongest forms of psychological protection you can develop. Think about how manipulation usually works. Rarely does someone tell you exactly what they want in a direct and honest way. Instead, they create an emotional state that quietly moves you toward the decision they wanted from the beginning. They provoke your anger, so you speak carelessly. They create fear, so you accept unfavorable conditions. They flatter your ego, so you trust them too quickly. They trigger guilt, so you ignore your own boundaries. Notice the pattern. The goal is never the emotion itself. The emotion is only the tool. The real objective is your behavior. Once your emotions begin making decisions instead of your logic, the manipulator has already gained influence over you. Machiavelli understood that self-mastery always comes before influence over others. A person who cannot govern their own emotions will eventually become governed by someone else's strategy. That is why emotionally reactive people are often manipulated without realizing it. They believe they are making independent choices, but their choices are actually being directed by carefully created emotional pressure. The manipulator simply provides the trigger. The reaction does the rest. Consider how easily anger destroys judgment. Someone insults you publicly, and suddenly your only goal becomes proving them wrong. You stop thinking strategically. You reveal information you should have kept private. You make promises you cannot keep. You say words you later regret. From the outside, it appears as though the manipulator won the argument. In reality, they won much earlier, the moment they convinced you to abandon emotional control. They understood something you temporarily forgot. Angry people become predictable, and predictable people become easy to control. Fear operates the same way. Manipulators often create the illusion that something terrible will happen if you do not obey them. They exaggerate consequences. They invent deadlines. They suggest that opportunities will disappear forever unless you act immediately. Fear narrows your thinking. Instead of carefully evaluating the situation, your mind focuses only on escaping discomfort. That is exactly what the manipulator wants. Calm people ask questions. Fearful people seek immediate relief. The difference between those two responses often determines who remains free and who becomes controlled. Approval is another emotional weakness that manipulators quietly exploit. Human beings naturally want to be liked, respected, and accepted. There's nothing wrong with that. The danger begins when your self-worth depends on someone else's approval. A manipulator quickly notices this need. They praise you when you obey and withdraw affection when you become independent. Over time, you unconsciously begin changing your behavior just to recover the approval you once received. Without realizing it, you are no longer acting according to your own values. You are acting according to whatever earns someone else's validation. This is emotional dependence disguised as connection. The strongest defense against all of these tactics is emotional discipline. That does not mean becoming cold or pretending you have no feelings. It means refusing to let temporary emotions make permanent decisions. Before reacting, ask yourself a simple question. What emotion am I feeling right now, and who benefits if I act while feeling it? That question alone can prevent countless mistakes. It forces you to separate the emotion from the decision. Once you create that separation, manipulation immediately becomes more difficult, because the emotional shortcut no longer works. Notice how truly powerful individuals respond during conflict. They rarely rush to defend themselves. They do not argue simply because someone provokes them. They remain calm long enough to understand what is actually happening beneath the surface. Sometimes they say very little. Sometimes they choose silence instead of reaction. This is not weakness. It is strategic discipline. They know that the person trying hardest to provoke emotion is often the person who needs that emotional reaction to gain control. Another important lesson is learning to become comfortable with discomfort. Manipulators succeed because most people cannot tolerate uncomfortable emotions. They cannot tolerate guilt, rejection, criticism, uncertainty, or temporary loneliness. As a result, they make quick decisions simply to escape those feelings. But emotionally disciplined people understand that discomfort is temporary. They are willing to sit with difficult emotions until clarity returns. They know that making decisions while emotionally overwhelmed almost always benefits someone else more than themselves. Over time, emotional discipline changes the way people interact with you. Manipulators begin losing interest because their usual tactics stop producing results. Guilt no longer changes your boundaries. Anger no longer controls your words. Fear no longer rushes your decisions. Praise no longer blinds your judgment. Instead of responding emotionally, you begin responding intentionally. That single change quietly shifts power back into your own hands. You stop becoming someone who can be emotionally directed and become someone whose choices are guided by reason, observation, and self-control, because the moment your emotions stop making your decisions, manipulators lose the strongest weapon they ever had against you. One of the greatest advantages a manipulator has over most people is not intelligence, money, or status. It is access. The moment you begin explaining every decision you make, every boundary you set, and every choice you take, you unknowingly give them exactly what they need: information and opportunities. This is why one of the strongest defenses against manipulation is learning to stop explaining yourself unnecessarily. Every extra sentence you speak creates another opening for someone to question you, confuse you, pressure you, or slowly wear down your confidence. Manipulators understand this better than anyone else. They know that a person who keeps talking will eventually reveal something that can be used against them. That is why mastering the art of firm boundaries and measured communication makes you far more difficult to control. Think about what happens whenever you tell someone no. For many people, the word alone feels uncomfortable. Almost immediately, they begin explaining themselves. I'm sorry, but I'm busy. I really wish I could help, but it's not because I don't care. Before long, a simple answer has turned into a long emotional speech. To an honest person, this may seem harmless. To a manipulator, it is an invitation. Every reason you provide becomes something they can attack. If you say you're busy, they argue that it won't take long. If you say you're tired, they tell you that you're overreacting. If you say you have other priorities, they question whether those priorities are really more important than them. Notice what has happened. They are no longer respecting your decision. They are negotiating your boundaries because you accidentally gave them material to work with. Machiavelli understood that certainty creates authority. People naturally challenge those who appear uncertain. The more desperately you try to justify your position, the more others assume your position can be changed. But someone who calmly says, "That doesn't work for me," and remains composed, communicates something completely different. They are not inviting debate. They are simply expressing a decision. Confidence often sounds quieter than insecurity because it does not feel the need to convince everyone. Manipulators quickly recognize the difference. They avoid people whose boundaries remain firm because those people are simply too expensive to manipulate emotionally. Many people over-explain because they are afraid of disappointing others. They believe that if everyone understands their reasons, conflict will disappear. Unfortunately, manipulators are not looking for understanding. They are looking for leverage. Every explanation gives them another opportunity to create doubt inside your mind. They may say, "Are you sure that's the real reason?" Or, "I thought you cared about me." Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about your original decision. It becomes about defending your character. This is exactly where manipulation becomes powerful. The issue changes from your boundary to your identity. Instead of protecting your decision, you begin trying to prove that you are still kind, loyal, generous, or loving. That emotional shift is exactly what the manipulator wanted. Strong boundaries also require accepting something many people struggle with. Not everyone has to agree with your decisions. Manipulators often rely on your fear of disapproval. They know that if criticism makes you uncomfortable, they can use criticism as a weapon. They question your choices until you begin questioning yourself. But emotionally disciplined people recognize that disagreement is not danger. Someone being unhappy with your boundary does not automatically mean your boundary is wrong. In fact, unhealthy people often become the most uncomfortable when they realize they can no longer control your behavior. Their Frustration is sometimes evidence that your boundary is finally working. Another common manipulation tactic is turning simple conversations into exhausting debates. You make one clear decision and suddenly you are answering endless questions. Why? But what if, don't you think you're being unfair? Hours later, you realize you have spent all your energy defending something that should never have required a defense in the first place. Manipulators understand that exhaustion weakens resistance. If they cannot convince you immediately, they simply keep talking until you become mentally tired. Many people eventually give in, not because they change their mind, but because they want the conversation to end. Learning to say less protects you from this trap because short answers leave very little room for endless negotiation. Notice how people with genuine authority communicate. They rarely speak in long emotional paragraphs. They state expectations clearly. They enforce boundaries consistently. They do not become angry every time someone disagrees, nor do they become desperate to be understood. Their consistency is what gives their words power. Manipulators struggle with this type of person because consistency removes uncertainty. They cannot exploit confusion if confusion does not exist. They cannot exploit guilt if guilt no longer changes your decisions. This does not mean becoming cold or disrespectful. Healthy communication still matters. Kindness still matters. But kindness without boundaries becomes permission for manipulation. Respecting others should never require abandoning respect for yourself. The strongest communicators understand that they can be polite without becoming available to emotional pressure. They can listen without surrendering their judgment. They can care deeply about people without allowing those people to control every decision they make. As you begin practicing this habit, you notice something surprising. Conversations become shorter, calmer, and much more honest. The people who genuinely respect you accept your boundaries without endless arguments. The people who become angry often reveal that they were benefiting from your lack of boundaries all along. That realization becomes one of the clearest lessons in human psychology. Healthy people respect limits. Manipulative people resist them because limits reduce their influence. Because the moment you stop explaining every boundary, you stop giving manipulators the openings they need to slowly take control of your mind. If there is one weakness that almost every manipulator searches for before they make their move, it is emotional dependence. They know something that most people never stop to think about. The easiest person to control is the one who believes their happiness depends on someone else. The moment your confidence, peace, identity, or self-worth is placed in another person's hands, you have already surrendered a part of your freedom. From that point forward, manipulation no longer requires force. It only requires controlling what you value most. This is why one of the greatest defenses against manipulation is learning to build your self-worth from within instead of borrowing it from the opinions, affection, or approval of other people. Think about how manipulation often begins. At first, the manipulator makes you feel special. They constantly praise you, validate your ideas, and make you believe you have finally found someone who truly understands you. The attention feels exciting because it satisfies a deep emotional need, but slowly, almost without noticing, something changes. The approval becomes less consistent. Compliments become rewards instead of gifts. Affection appears only when you behave the way they expect. Suddenly, you find yourself working harder just to receive the same attention that once came effortlessly. This is not love, it is conditioning. The manipulator is teaching your mind to associate obedience with emotional comfort. The more dependent you become on their approval, the easier it becomes for them to influence your choices. Machiavelli understood that dependence creates vulnerability. A person who cannot walk away from something can always be controlled through it. If someone cannot bear rejection, rejection becomes a weapon. If someone cannot tolerate loneliness, loneliness becomes a threat. If someone desperately needs praise, praise becomes a tool for control. The manipulator does not need to change who you are. They simply identify what you fear losing and quietly position themselves between you and that emotional need. From that moment on, your own desires begin working against you. Notice how emotionally independent people behave differently. They appreciate kindness, but they do not depend on it. They value relationships, but they do not sacrifice their identity to keep them. They enjoy praise, but they do not require constant validation to believe in themselves. This balance makes manipulation incredibly difficult because emotional rewards and punishments lose much of their influence. When your self-respect comes from your own principles instead of someone else's approval, manipulative tactics begin failing one after another. Many people mistakenly believe confidence means believing you are better than everyone else. Real confidence is much quieter than that. It is simply trusting your own judgment enough that you do not constantly need strangers to confirm your value. Manipulators look for people who continuously seek reassurance because reassurance can easily be controlled. Today they give it, tomorrow they withhold it. Soon the other person begins chasing emotional validation without even realizing it. This cycle continues until the manipulator quietly occupies the center of the victim's emotional world. Another common manipulation tactic is creating the fear of abandonment. A manipulator may suggest that no one else will understand you, support you, or love you the way they do. They slowly isolate you from other perspectives until their opinion becomes the only one that truly matters. This is dangerous because isolation weakens independent thinking. When only one voice remains in your life, that voice becomes increasingly powerful. Emotionally strong people avoid this trap by maintaining healthy independence. They protect friendships, family connections, personal interests, and individual goals because they understand that a balanced life cannot easily be controlled by one person. You must also learn the difference between love and emotional dependence. Love encourages growth, honesty, and freedom. Emotional dependence creates anxiety, fear, and constant uncertainty. Love respects your boundaries. Dependence makes you afraid to have boundaries. Love allows disagreement without threatening the relationship. Dependence convinces you that every disagreement could cost you everything. Manipulators intentionally blur these differences because confusion benefits them. They want control to feel like affection and obedience to feel like loyalty. The more clearly you recognize this difference, the less effective their influence becomes. One of the strongest habits you can build is becoming comfortable with your own company. Many people remain in unhealthy situations simply because they fear being alone more than they fear being manipulated. Manipulators recognize this immediately. They understand that someone who cannot tolerate solitude will often accept disrespect just to avoid loneliness. But the person who has learned to enjoy their own peace becomes extraordinarily difficult to pressure. They no longer negotiate their dignity for temporary comfort because they know that losing themselves is a far greater cost than spending time alone. As your self-worth becomes stronger, something remarkable begins happening. Criticism no longer destroys your confidence because your identity is not built upon public opinion. Praise no longer blinds your judgment because you do not mistake compliments for truth. Rejection no longer controls your decisions because you understand that another person's acceptance does not determine your value. This emotional stability quietly transforms every relationship in your life. Healthy people respect it. Manipulative people often become frustrated by it because their usual strategies suddenly stop producing results. Eventually, you realize that freedom begins long before someone tries to manipulate you. It begins the moment you stop allowing other people to decide how valuable you feel. The strongest protection against manipulation is not becoming suspicious of everyone. It is becoming secure enough within yourself that no one else's approval becomes necessary for your peace of mind. Once that foundation exists, manipulation loses its greatest source of power because your emotional center can no longer be moved by someone else's approval or rejection. Because the moment your self-worth belongs to you instead of to other people, manipulation stops finding the emotional leverage it needs to control your life. After understanding how manipulators observe people, exploit emotional reactions, use psychological tactics, attack weak boundaries, and feed on emotional dependence, one final lesson brings all of these ideas together. The people who are the hardest to manipulate are not necessarily the strongest, the richest, or the smartest. They are the most difficult to predict. Manipulators survive by reading patterns. They study habits, emotional triggers, routines, fears, and desires until they know exactly how someone is likely to respond. Once your reactions become predictable, influencing you becomes much easier. But when your decisions are guided by discipline instead of impulse, when your emotions remain steady instead of explosive, and when your private life is not constantly displayed for everyone to examine, manipulation begins falling apart because there is very little left to exploit. Machiavelli understood that mystery has always been a form of protection. This does not mean becoming dishonest or pretending to be someone you are not. It means understanding that not every thought belongs in every conversation, not every